Hey, this is Tim Ash, President of the Vermont State Senate. It's Wednesday, May 20th, here for my daily update on Vermont's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As I mentioned yesterday, I'm going to focus the entirety of this update on a detailed walkthrough of the governor's proposed, what he calls first phase of our economic recovery from the damage that's been inflicted by the state of emergency we're in and the stay-at-home order and all the business shutdowns. So before I get into the details of what the governor has proposed, I want to talk a little bit about the process from here on out. I think you'll recall back in March when it was clear the whole nation was gripped in a crisis related to COVID-19, and the Congress, working with the White House in virtually no time at all, passed a massive federal relief bill. And in some ways, it was commendable that when they saw that we were in crisis mode, they were able to quickly pass a bill. But we've seen the execution of it, which has been quite flawed, despite some very positive developments. And so one of the things that I hope to impart to you right now is that the governor and the legislature have worked together to establish a process by which these federal monies would be spent. We've already spent about $150 million of the federal relief money that's come to us on absolutely critical emergency expenditures like personal protective equipment, medical personnel, food supplies, those kinds of things, which, as I said early on in this crisis, my attitude is let's save lives first, worry about the accounting later. That's totaled to about $150 million. And while I said let's worry about the accounting later, obviously we want it to be spent on appropriate things. But those dollars had to get out the door on the quick to make sure that we were protecting people and getting the money out there to support basic needs being met. For subsequent use of those federal relief funds that weren't of that absolutely emergent nature, we proposed, and the governor ultimately agreed, that we would receive proposals from the governor and work through a sort of a typical legislative budgeting process, but knowing that the nature of these funds, we have to move much quicker than the normal legislative process. So what the governor did today was proposed how to use the first $400 million of what remains of the federal relief funds we received about a month and a half ago. That now goes to the legislature to consider and work with the governor's team, not only to vet the ideas the governor has put on the table, but then to consider whether we think there are things missing that ought to be added. All of this comes with an asterisk or a footnote that the funds that I'm about to describe cannot just be used for any old thing. We can't use it to just pay for normal state employee salaries because we'd rather have federal money do it than Vermont taxpayer money. It has to have a linkage to COVID-19, either economic losses or additional expenditures that have been required to meet this moment. So it's a little unusual for me to be articulating what the governor has proposed. In years past, the governor's budgets have not been presented in ways that reflected the kind of investments I would like to see, or many other people in the Senate or the House. And so we go through a 4-month process of back and forth until we ultimately agree on a budget. But the reason I make an exception this time is we are in crisis mode, and the normal debate about $5,000 here, $5,000 there is not appropriate at this moment. It's really about identifying the key sectors that need funds to be infused in order to prevent a near-term collapse of some industries altogether, and make sure that we start the process of rebuilding our economy. And we'll have some disagreements in the days ahead with either the mechanics of some of the governor's proposals. We might not even like some of the governor's proposals ultimately, and we may have some more that we want to add to the table, but we do totally appreciate the urgency of action. And this is, as I say, phase one. There will have to be subsequent measures taken, and this is all still operating under the assumption that we don't get any more federal relief while we hope we do. So without further ado, I am now going to try to use technology here for the benefit of walking through what the governor has proposed, and hope that, well, I hope that it works, but let's try this here and do this and do this. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do here is walk through the overview of what is in the governor's proposal today. The number that will be thrown around is that the governor proposed $400 million of recovery funding. What you'll see here is that the box in this colored area here is what's called the first phase, which is really survival mode, making sure that businesses, nonprofits, and others who are literally contemplating whether they'll ever open again, getting dollars to them to stabilize them. Then when we look over to this second side here, we're talking about recovery sort of moving forward, and it's really about rebuilding and trying to get strong again. So I'm going to start over here. This is really the big ticket item in this area here. You'll see a proposed $250 million used for a variety of grants and loans to primarily to small businesses. We'll talk a bit in a second about where that money would be spent, but it is primarily to get dollars in the pocket of businesses who have either been forced to close or who have had substantial losses as a result of COVID-19. The $50 million in housing assistance here really speaks to two different categories. It is not for going out and building single-family homes or market-rate apartments. What this is really meant to do here is to help cover basically missed rent payments so that both tenants and landlords don't find themselves on the tenant side either getting evicted largely because of the financial situation in the months ahead, and that landlords don't find themselves not being able to pay their mortgage because the tenant couldn't pay them. So this is a situation oftentimes, landlords and tenants are viewed as being pitted against one another. Both of them are up against it right now. And this proposes a substantial amount of money to help pay back rent, arrearages, and make sure that our rental housing network or system can weather this storm. It also envisions some dollars, which I'll talk about in a little bit more detail in a second, to go towards sort of a rapid housing program for many of the individuals who currently are homeless and have been moved into motel spaces to isolate during COVID-19. Obviously, as many of those individuals who can find themselves in safe housing, it's best for everyone involved and allows us to support them and get their lives back in order and support them in the ways they need. Down here, you'll see technical assistance of $5 million. This is really envisioned to look like, almost like business consultants who would be able to work with businesses who have been facing whatever the particular challenges COVID has presented them and help them get through it. And then over here, probably the least well understood of the four primary source or expected uses of funds here is marketing money. I think the primary goal here is to encourage as many Vermonters to spend as much of their money locally and not ship it out of state. A very commendable goal. How this marketing funds would do that is yet to be seen. And then over here, this phase 2 section is a little bit further out, I think, in terms of when the dollars would be spent. We'll learn a little bit more about that in the coming days. Again, financial assistance, housing assistance, which we can look at the details in a second. Something called Better Places Community Grants. This is meant to be a flexible program to get dollars to communities to do things that will make it more attractive or culturally rich for people to go back into downtowns and village centers when we get to the other side of this. Broadband investment, this is a amount that is less than I would like to see. I'd like to see this as a prominent feature in our recovery plans. My hope is that we can build upon what's being proposed here. Some retraining for people who are out of work if the jobs aren't there when we come back. Permitting modernization is something that happens, it seems, every time we have a crisis. A governor proposes fundamentally changing the permitting system. The legislature is already working on some positive improvements to our Act 250 system that protect the environment, continue to have community involvement, but modernize. So if that's what the governor has in mind, we'll hopefully be able to work well with them. If it's an attempt to degrade environmental requirements, that's probably going to not do so well. So now I'm going to shift into the more detailed view. And here's where you start to see the really granular amount of money being spent. Over here, where you see the $150 million for what's called Restart Vermont Emergency Action Grants, I had encouraged the governor, and I think this is, no, I was not the only one because many businesses were the ones talking to me about it. This is largely for expenses that had to be paid during the crisis, unavoidable, but didn't really have revenues coming in to pay them. So things like rent, mortgage, utilities, other fixed operating expenses that small business owners are really struggling to pay right now. There would be a cap, and those details will be forthcoming, but is really looking to infuse cash for payments that can't be avoided. Here you see effectively a second type of emergency action. This would be a loan and grant program, primarily focused on a longer term payment at 0% interest rates, and designed for those who did not qualify for the much more generous program that you see above. And then below that, another $20 million, which would be going basically as interest rate buy downs to help people afford whatever debt they have right now. This would be for particularly small businesses. If you look here, area of need, micro businesses is really like very, very small. Nonprofits, all with revenues less than $1 million. So many of our small nonprofit organizations who are struggling, especially cultural organizations, many small businesses that might have 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 employees, and then a range of others. This will help some of them with grants, some of them with very, very low-cost loans. And that adds up to a grand total of $250 million out of that 400. When we turn over here, you'll see what I referred to in terms of stabilizing rental housing, $42 million. There's going to be a lot of back and forth between the legislature and the administration on this. While we're, of course, sympathetic to making sure that we don't have massive dislocation of tenants and we don't have property owners losing their property to the bank just because COVID-19 made it impossible for them to collect rent, we'll want to make sure that this is going to, that this, on the one hand, isn't just helping people decide they don't want to pay rent, but also making sure that property owners who have not been impacted negatively by COVID-19 because their tenants continued to pay and had the ability to, that we're not sending money where it's not needed. So all of that becomes a little subjective, but when you come up with a program like this, it's got to have rules that accommodate equity, fairness, and not squandering taxpayer money. Because every dollar that goes here, that would be, if it was a dollar that was not well spent, it's a dollar that isn't going to support small business owners or any of the other potential uses. And then the $8 million here for Rehousing Recovery Fund. This is projected to support up to about 250 units of new housing to rehouse homeless families. And one of the successful models we've been using in recent years, we used to put people up overnight for months at a time at motels. A few of us about 5 years ago said, well, heck, why don't we just buy the motel and provide services to the individuals who are being housed there so that we can help get them on the road to self-sufficiency, which has been a good model. So this builds on that strategy to the tune of $8 million. And then the last bit of detail on that first phase of funding is technical assistance for $5 million. So 4.75 of it really coming in, helping, whether it's people, CPAs, attorneys, the kinds of professional consultants who often will advise businesses in what to do in light of their current situation to get to a more sustainable model moving forward. This is, on the one hand, seems a little bit of a nebulous concept that we're just going to have all these people out there trying to help people figure out what to do next. But knowing many, many, many small business owners, myself, all of them are trying to figure out not just how to move forward from where they are today, but also with the unpredictability of what might happen in the fall going into the early winter. Perhaps the lowest dollar amount in this whole thing is for the Employee Assistance Program. Those of you who work at larger organizations will be familiar with the term Employee Assistance Program. This is if you're having personal challenges, you're feeling depressed, you're anxious, you are struggling to focus at work, you have personal problems at home that are impacting your ability to work. This is effectively a confidential consulting service which is there for people, and I think too few people actually utilize it because it's a very valuable resource. And then the last piece over here in the marketing section is really trying to do a very big Keep Your Money in Vermont program. And we'll have to figure out what is really required to encourage Vermonters to keep their money here. Because for now, most Vermonters are planning on sticking around for the long term and pulling back on vacations. So what this might mean is an encouragement for people to visit other parts of Vermont, which maybe they don't. For instance, many people in the Burlington area don't know, every corner of Vermont is beautiful, but I'm not sure that the Burlington to Bennington tourism pipeline is very rich, but it should be, because both communities benefit by visiting one another, and that's true of every other crisscrossing of the state that could occur. So if it's there to help encourage people to spend their dollars locally, and it's not telling us to do things we're already going to do, then it could be very, very helpful. Most of these funds, when you review this, if you go back and look after, envision RFPs being issued, meaning request for proposals, so that private entities would effectively apply to the state to be the one who manages a particular program or effort. And sometimes that's a smooth process and produces very good results. Sometimes it's bureaucratic and cumbersome and inefficient. So we'll want to make sure we understand how quickly the dollars can get out to support people in that regard as well. Another particular piece that we're going to want to look at is a proposal to provide basically $50 million for the dairy industry, 40 for sort of straight commodity milk, mostly for cow milk, but also goat and sheep milk, and then for some of the processing that goes on. The reason I mentioned we'll want to take a look at this is not because we don't want to provide support to our dairy farmers who are struggling very badly, but to make sure we're not ignoring all of the other farmers who have struggled as well during this, during these last 2+ months. So the dairy industry is already in great crisis. The small number of distributors and handlers of milk pay our farmers next to nothing. It's really quite a scandal, and we'll want to make sure that we're not providing this scarce resource to our dairy farmers only to have it get sucked up by the big massive corporations who pick up the milk and turn it into a brand name somewhere else. So be on the lookout for that. And at this point, I think I'm going to go back out of the screen share, and you can go back and look at any of those, and also email me if you would like to review or get the PDF documents sent to you. I'm happy to send those to you. And I walk through those largely because it'll help stimulate your thinking about what you think is really critical to get Vermont back on its economic feet. Most of what you just heard are on the surface. You say, well, let's get money out to the businesses who are suffering. Let's get money to the farmers. Let's do all those things. But what you ought to be thinking about, and this is one of the challenges in the legislature, is we have to think not just, is that a good use of funds? Would it do a good thing if we put the money there? But are there other things that we're not talking about that might be even better? An example would be upgrading school facilities that have very poor HVAC systems, so that when kids go back in the fall, we're not as sure that the airflow is healthy and appropriate. The broadband piece, which I described as being fairly modest in the governor's proposal, is that something that should be emphasized even more than it is right now. Even a jobs program. One of my particular passions is trying to get more young people into meaningful work experiences like Vermont Youth Conservation Corps or Vermont Works for Women or Youth Build. And I think this could be the moment for almost like a mini civilian conservation corps program in Vermont, especially since so many kids are not sure if they're going to go to college in the fall in light of the unpredictability. So there's always other options that need to be considered, so you know that the use of funds that you're proposing are the best use compared to the other options. So I hope you'll be thinking about that and feeling free to send me your thoughts. With that, I'm going to wrap for the day and say that I think this is a good start for sure. I'm really looking forward to working with the governor, the speaker, members of the Senate and the House to get us through this. And like with anything, now we have to get into the details and think about other alternatives. So I will be back with another video tomorrow at 5:30, and hope that you stay safe in the meantime.